There is a scene roughly 4 minutes into the 4th episode of the 2nd season of Invincible, the episode called It's Been a While that aired on November 24th, 2023, where the most powerful being in the known galaxy floats motionless toward a black hole. He does not fight the pull. He does not speak. He just drifts, arms at his sides, eyes open, drawn slowly toward an event horizon that even he cannot escape. He had killed thousands. He had killed his friends. He had nearly killed his son. He had wept briefly in space, and then chosen to keep falling. There was no one watching. That scene is the philosophy of Omni-Man, and it is not the one most people argue about. The argument most people have about Nolan Grayson is the one that takes place inside the wreckage of a train station in Chicago, where a father holds his son by the shoulders and demands an answer to a question that sounds like an ultimatum and is actually a confession. What will you have after 500 years? The argument they should be having is the one that takes place in absolute silence, between a man and a singularity, with no witnesses, no audience, no opportunity for performance. The first scene is iconic. The second scene is the show. Here is what most analyses of this character miss. The philosophy of Omni-Man is not really a single philosophy. It is two of them in collision, with a man in the middle who keeps forgetting which one he is supposed to believe. One was given to him at birth, the other was given to him by a wife, a son, a tailor, and a comic book shop. The whole arc of the character, across 4 seasons of television, is the slow public discovery of which philosophy actually wins and what it costs the man in the middle to find out. This is going to take some time. The story is older than the show, older than the comic, older than the genre. It is the oldest story there is. It is just that this version of it happens to be told by a man with a mustache who can punch through a planet. Before going further, a quick note. Long-form essays like this keep getting made because of viewers who quietly hit subscribe at some point along the way. It takes a few seconds, it costs nothing, and it genuinely helps. Now, back to the man in the middle. The first time you meet Nolan Grayson is on March 25th, 2021, in the opening minutes of the first episode of Invincible, an episode called It's About Time. He is in a suit. He is at a press event. He is the kind of public figure who looks tired in the way successful men look tired, and he is being interviewed about a book he has just published. His cover identity, the show eventually reveals, is that of a travel writer, a man who goes to interesting places and writes about them, a man whose job is to pay attention to other cultures and bring back observations. That is the lie. But like all of the most durable lies, it is built on something true. He really does go places. He really does pay attention, and by the end of his time on Earth, the observations he has brought back are not lies anymore. They are him. There is a small visual detail in those first episodes that almost no one talks about because it does not seem like a detail. It just seems like part of the suburban texture of the show. He kisses his wife in the kitchen. Not a peck, not a stage kiss. The slow, familiar, slightly tired kiss of two people who have been married long enough that the kiss has stopped being a question and become a punctuation mark. The morning ends, the kiss ends it, he flies to work, she gets coffee. It is a small image. You have probably seen 10,000 small images like it in 10,000 pieces of television. The image is so ordinary it disappears. The second time you see that kiss, after you know what Nolan Grayson actually is, the entire image rearranges itself. The philosophical question the show asks, very quietly, in those first 3 episodes, is whether the kiss was a lie. The instinct of most viewers on a first watch is to say yes. He was performing. He had been performing for 20 years. He was a Viltrumite sleeper agent assigned to soften the planet for conquest, and every moment of warmth he ever showed his family was theater, executed by a man whose actual species considers attachment a weakness to be bred out of the bloodline. The kiss was theater, the marriage was theater, the fatherhood was theater. Here is what most people miss about that reading. It is exactly the reading the Empire wants you to come to, because if the kiss was theater, then the Empire's philosophy is intact. And what happened in episode 8 was simply the curtain coming down. The actor finally took off the makeup. The face under the makeup was the real face, and the warmth was always fake. But that is not what the show argues. The show argues with a patience that takes 4 seasons to fully unfold, that the kiss was real, not because Nolan intended it to be, not because the Viltrumite assigned to soften a planet was secretly a romantic. The show argues something stranger and harder to live with. The show argues that if you wear a mask for 20 years, the mask becomes a face. Not metaphorically, mechanically, cellularly. The man who flew home from work every evening to a woman he had decided was a strategic asset became, by the slow accumulation of evenings, the man who flew home to his wife. Whatever he was when he landed on Earth, by the time he kissed Debbie Grayson goodbye on a Tuesday morning in his kitchen, the kiss was not theater. The kiss had absorbed him. This is the philosophical concept that runs underneath the entire character of Omni-Man, and it is worth slowing down to name it properly. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called it mauvaise foi, which is usually translated as bad faith. Bad faith is the condition of pretending to be something you are not so thoroughly that you forget the pretense. Sartre's most famous example is a waiter in a Paris cafe. The waiter is so completely the waiter, so attentive and balletic and devoted to the role, that he has stopped being a man who is waiting tables and become, in his own mind, the role itself. He has surrendered the awkward freedom of being a person for the smoother comfort of being a function. Sartre's argument is that this is a kind of moral cowardice. You can refuse to choose by becoming what you do. What the show does with Nolan Grayson is a beautiful inversion of this idea. Sartre treated bad faith as a flight from freedom. The character of Omni-Man treats it as a flight toward a freedom he was never allowed to have. The Viltrumite Empire raises its children to be functions. They are not people who happen to conquer planets. They are conquerors who happen to wear the bodies of people. Their faces are designed to be useful, their loyalties are designed to be useful. Even their sexual partners in the Empire's official ideology are useful. Nolan was a function before he ever met Debbie. He was not pretending to be a Viltrumite. He was a Viltrumite the same way a hammer is a hammer. And then he was assigned to play a person on Earth. And then he played a person on Earth for 20 years. And somewhere in those 20 years, something happened that the Empire did not predict and could not measure. The function became a person. The performance became a life. The waiter forgot, slowly, that he was a waiter, and was startled when the time came to leave the cafe to discover that he had grown attached to the chairs. You can see this happening in flashbacks across the entire series, but it is most visible in the small scenes. Watch him with Art Rosenbaum, his tailor, and one of his only real friends, the character voiced by Mark Hamill. Art makes him drinks. Art jokes with him. Art notices when something is bothering him. There is a scene in the first season where Nolan, who has just murdered 7 of his colleagues, comes to Art for a costume repair, and Art reads his mood as concern and tries to comfort him. The audience knows what Nolan has done. Art does not, and in that asymmetry, the show plants a small philosophical landmine. Because Nolan, in those moments, accepts the comfort. He does not refuse it. He does not laugh inside about how stupid the human is for offering it. He sits in the comfort. He absorbs it. He needs it. A Viltrumite, according to Viltrumite doctrine, would not need comfort from a tailor. A Viltrumite, according to Viltrumite doctrine, would not need anything from anyone weaker than himself. The Empire is built on the premise that need is contamination. To need is to be vulnerable. To be vulnerable is to be weak. To be weak is to be unfit for Empire. And so the Empire bred itself across thousands of years into a species that does not visibly need. But Nolan, in his kitchen, in his living room, in his tailor's back office, in his son's bedroom doorway, needs. He needs the kiss. He needs the joke. He needs the small affection of an old human in a slightly cluttered shop. He does not know he needs these things, which is the most damning evidence that he does. The things you most need are usually the things you have forgotten you are using. You only notice the floor when it disappears. The Viltrumite Empire's deepest miscalculation, which the show takes 4 seasons to make fully visible, is that they assumed a sleeper agent could be sent to live among humans and remain unchanged. They assumed the role would be the mask. They did not consider that for a species that has bred attachment out of itself, even the smallest amount of attachment, accumulated over enough years, would feel like discovering a new color. Nolan did not fall in love with Debbie because he was secretly a softer Viltrumite than the others. Nolan fell in love with Debbie because he was a Viltrumite, which means he had never been allowed to love anyone. And Earth, for all its inferior gravity and slow technology, is a place where love is unavoidable. It is in the air. It is in the food. It is in the way human beings hold each other when they say goodbye in airports. Nolan was assigned to a planet that runs on the very thing his species had spent 1,000 generations trying to surgically remove from itself. He was assigned, in other words, to an addiction he did not know existed. And he became addicted. This is why the moment that breaks Debbie in the 2nd season is not the moment she learns her husband was an alien. It is not the moment she learns he killed his friends. It is the moment she learns he called her a pet. The line delivered during the Chicago fight in episode 8 was simple. He said, with the calm of a man explaining a tax form, that he did love her, but that she was more like a pet to him. Debbie spends the entirety of the 2nd season trying to figure out whether that line was the truth, or whether it was the second lie, whether the husband she loved was the lie, or whether the husband she heard speak from a smashed train platform was the lie, or whether somehow both were true at the same time, in different parts of him, and the man she married had been carrying both of them home every night for 20 years. The show, to its credit, refuses to give her a clean answer, because the clean answer would betray the philosophy. The honest answer, the one the writing arrives at slowly and never says out loud, is that he was telling the truth both times. The husband who kissed her in the kitchen was real. The husband who called her a pet was also real. They were the same man, in different states of cognitive dissonance, and the line that betrayed her was uttered in the only moment of his life when the dissonance had to collapse into a single position. He had been ordered to conquer the planet she lived on, which meant he had to choose in real time in front of his son whether his actual feelings or his official feelings were going to be the basis of his next decision. And he chose in that moment the official ones. He chose the philosophy. He spent the next 3 seasons paying for that choice, and the bill turned out to be larger than he had ever realized. There is one more thing worth noticing about the mask question before moving on, because it sets up everything that follows. The Viltrumite Empire, as the show eventually reveals, has fewer than 50 pure-blooded Viltrumites left in the universe. This is the Empire's most closely guarded secret. The most powerful conquerors in the known galaxy are an endangered species. Their entire Imperial project, all the conquest and the breeding and the careful selection, is the last desperate strategy of a population that almost killed itself becoming strong. They are running out of people. They have been running out of people for a long time, and the only way they have figured out how to make more of themselves is to send their remaining warriors to other planets, breed with local populations, and hope the children come out Viltrumite enough to count. Nolan Grayson, in other words, was sent to Earth not just to soften the planet for conquest. He was sent to Earth to make a child. The marriage was a breeding program. Mark was the product. And the philosophy of the Empire is the philosophy of a dying species trying to convince itself that it is winning. Strength as ideology, conquest as identity, the bred surrender of every soft tissue that could connect you to anything that does not look like you. Because if the soft tissue ever grows back, you find yourself doing something a Viltrumite is not supposed to be able to do. You find yourself missing your wife, you find yourself at the edge of a black hole with no one watching, choosing to let go. This is the first half of the philosophy of Omni-Man. The man behind the mask was not a different man from the man in front of the mask. He was the man the mask had made, slowly, against the Empire's intentions, in a kitchen on a Tuesday morning, 20 years deep. The second half of the philosophy is what happens when the man in front of the mask is given a direct order to kill the man behind it. To understand that, you have to understand what the Empire actually believes. Not the version it broadcasts, the version it lives by. And to understand what the Empire believes, you have to go back about 3 minutes earlier in episode 1 of season 1 to a conference room at the headquarters of the Guardians of the Globe, where 7 people are about to die because one of them is loyal to a doctrine the others have never heard of and could not bring themselves to take seriously even if they had. The doctrine is older than any of them. It is older than the show. It is older in some ways than any single philosophy you have ever been taught the name of, because it is the philosophy that almost every actual empire in human history has used to justify itself. And the show, very carefully, refuses to let you sleep through it. The Viltrumite Empire, as Nolan eventually explains it to Mark in the 8th episode of the first season, an episode called Where I Really Come From that aired on April 29, 2021, was not always an empire. It was a planet of ordinary beings who, at some point in their distant past, did something that changed them. They removed the weak. That is the phrase Nolan uses. He says it the way a person might say, "We decided to install plumbing." He says it as if it were a sensible reform, a civic improvement, a small chapter in an old book of mostly forgotten reforms. The natives of Viltrum, he tells his son, reached their full potential by removing the weak. That sentence does a tremendous amount of work, and it is worth holding it up to the light, because almost every word in it is doing something dishonest. The word natives is doing a lot. The word reached is doing more. The phrase full potential is doing the most. And the word removing is doing all the work that the others were assigned and could not handle. What Nolan is describing in those bedside manner sentences is a planetary genocide. The strong members of his species, at some point in the distant past, killed the weak ones, not in war, in policy. They identified, by whatever criteria they preferred at the time, who was insufficiently strong to belong, and they killed those people. Then they did it again, then again. Across generations, they bred themselves into the species they are now by repeatedly murdering whoever among them was insufficiently like the previous generation's version of strong. The Viltrumites you see on screen are the descendants of the survivors of an internal purge that never quite ended. The phrase full potential means whatever was left after the others had been killed. This is not a fantastical idea. This is almost exactly the philosophy that fueled some of the worst chapters in your own species' modern history. And the show knows it. The end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century enthusiasm for eugenics was built on this same sentence. The argument that a society could improve itself by selectively breeding for desired traits and selectively eliminating undesired ones, that it was simply applying agriculture to people, that it was the rational extension of evolutionary insight into civic life. The argument was made in respectable rooms by respectable men and women, in scientific journals and royal academies, in the founding documents of organizations whose names you would recognize. It was the dominant progressive idea of an entire generation of intellectuals on multiple continents, until the actual results of taking it seriously produced the photographs and the camps and the trains, after which the philosophy was very quickly disowned by almost everyone who had spent the previous 50 years repeating it. The Viltrumites are what that philosophy looks like when it gets to keep going. The Viltrumites are what happens when no one in the room ever has the moral nerve to say enough. They remove the weak, and then they removed the next weakest, and then the next, and at some point they crossed an invisible line and stopped being a species and started being an ideology that wore the bodies of a species. And by the time Nolan Gratian is born, on a planet whose population is so small that the Empire has to keep it a secret from its colonies, the philosophy is no longer a choice. It is the only philosophy any Viltrumite has ever been allowed to have. This is the doctrine Nolan is carrying when he flies to Earth. He is not a philosopher. He is not a fanatic. He is the 3rd or 4,000th generation of a species that has spent so long pruning itself that the pruning has become indistinguishable from existence. The doctrine, by his time, does not feel like an argument. It feels like physics. The strong are above, the weak are below. The strong have a responsibility to the weak. That responsibility is to either bring them into the Empire, where they will be ruled, or to remove them. Those are the two options. There is no third option. The third option, which is to leave the weak alone, is not on the table because the doctrine does not contain a notion of leaving people alone. The doctrine begins with the premise that all populations are subject to management. The only question is, who is doing the managing? Now, here's where most analyses of Omni-Man take a wrong turn that the show was not making. Most analyses of Omni-Man invoke Friedrich Nietzsche. Most analyses describe Nolan as Nietzschean. Most analyses cite the Übermensch, the master morality, the will to power. And most analyses are wrong in a way that matters. Nietzsche, when he wrote about the Übermensch, was not describing the Viltrumites. He was describing something much closer to the opposite. The Übermensch in Nietzsche's writing is a figure who creates his own values, who refuses inherited moralities, who walks alone above the herd and answers to no doctrine. The Viltrumites are an entire civilization of people who have not created their own values. They have inherited the values of the first generation that started removing the weak, and they have spent the rest of their history defending those values without ever examining them. They are a herd. They are the herd of strength. Their conformity happens to be the conformity of killers, but it is still conformity. Nietzsche would have despised them. The whole point of Nietzsche's critique of slave morality, which is the part of his philosophy that gets most often misused to justify imperial violence, was not that the strong should rule the weak. It was that the weak had invented a morality of resentment and called it virtue. The Viltrumites have not solved that problem. They have just inverted it. They have invented a morality of dominance and called it duty. They are slave morality with better aerodynamics. What Nolan represents then is not the Nietzschean Superman. He represents the failure mode that Nietzsche was warning about. He is what happens when a civilization decides to skip the hard work of generating its own values and instead just designates whichever values were already winning as the values worth dying for. The strong rule because they are strong. The strong are right because they are strong. The strong are good because they are strong. It is a closed loop. It feeds on itself. It cannot be argued with from the inside, because every argument that could be made against it is automatically classified as the protest of someone weaker than the person making the policy, which is, by the doctrine's own logic, exactly why that protest can be ignored. This is the closed loop Nolan was given as a child. This is the closed loop he has lived inside for several centuries. And this is the closed loop that begins, very slowly, to crack when he meets a woman whose only weapon is her willingness to keep showing up. The doctrine has one more layer worth understanding, because it is the layer that makes the Empire so philosophically dangerous, and it is the layer that the show gives Nolan almost word for word in his pitch to Mark. The Empire does not see itself as cruel. The Empire sees itself as benevolent. The Viltrumite project, by its own internal account, is the project of bringing peace to a chaotic galaxy. Conquered worlds, the doctrine says, will receive medical technology centuries ahead of what they had. They will have their wars ended. They will have their hungers eliminated. They will have their petty divisions absorbed into a larger order whose efficiencies will lift everyone. They will lose their freedom, which the doctrine views as a poorly designed luxury. They will gain their lives, which the doctrine views as the only good worth giving. This is, in the language of moral philosophy, a utilitarian argument. It says that the right action is the one that produces the most good for the greatest number, where good is defined in measurable material terms. More food, more medicine, fewer wars, fewer deaths, add it all up. Run the math the empire insists. Supports conquest, yes, you will be ruled. But you will live longer, eat better, and die in your beds instead of in battlefields. You are getting a discount on existence. The cost is sovereignty. The benefit is everything else. It is not a stupid argument. It is, in fact, one of the oldest justifications for empire in your own species' history. The Romans made it, the British made it, various 20th century powers made it in their own dialects. It is the argument that has always been made by the side that is already winning, and it has always had the same flaw, which the show, with admirable patience, lets the audience discover on its own. The flaw is the missing consent. A utilitarian argument that calculates the welfare of the conquered without ever asking the conquered what they would prefer has done something subtle and corrupt. It is decided in advance that the conquered are not the kind of people whose preferences count toward the math. They are inputs. They are not voters. Their welfare is a quantity to be optimized over their heads by a planner who knows, ahead of time, what is best for them. This is not benevolence. This is paternalism with weaponry, and it is the precise structure that Nolan uses in the train station when he tries to explain to Mark why they should be on the same side. We will stop their wars, he says. We will eliminate their hungers. We will give them medicine. We can help them. And he says these things without ever pausing to consider that he is talking about helping the people in the room they are standing in, who include the friends of his son, the wife he has lived with for 20 years, and the millions of other human beings whose only fault was being born on the planet that was assigned to him as a project. If the Empire were really benevolent, it would offer the deal. Submit to our governance in exchange for these benefits. It would let the conquered weigh the offer. It would honor a no. It does not do this. It cannot do this. Because the moment the Empire's offer is allowed to be refused, the Empire's premise about who counts as a thinking being is undermined, and the doctrine cannot survive that undermining. The Empire's benevolence is, in other words, conditional on the conquered being too stupid to be allowed a real choice. The Empire is benevolent on the same terms a farmer is benevolent to a herd. Care for the animals, improve their conditions, lengthen their lives. Just do not ask them what they would prefer, because the question is incoherent. They are not the kind of being that could give a useful answer. The audience watching this hears the doctrine for what it is. The audience is not in the doctrine. The audience can see the woman who is being called a pet. The audience can see the son who is being called a project. The audience can see the friends who have been called colleagues until the moment they had to die. And the show's philosophical achievement here is that it lets you watch a man who genuinely believes he is doing the right thing make every wrong move available to him. Because the doctrine he was raised inside has never once allowed him to imagine what the right thing might actually look like. There is a moment in the conference room with the Guardians of the Globe before the first punch is thrown where Nolan looks tired. He has flown to a meeting he himself called. He has gathered 7 of the most powerful beings on the planet, several of whom he has known for years, into a room. He is about to kill them. The doctrine requires it. The Empire's plan requires it. Their existence as Earth's primary line of defense is incompatible with the Empire's takeover schedule, and so, by the math, they must be removed. The math is clear. He looks tired anyway. It is worth noticing that look, because that look is not the look of a believer. That look is the look of a man whose belief is being asked to do too much work, in a room with too many old friends, on a planet he was supposed to soften and has, instead, sunk into. The doctrine, in that look, has stopped being physics. The doctrine has become a job, and the man who is about to do the job has spent 20 years living next to a woman whose only doctrine was that the people you care about are the people you stay near. He kills them anyway. What follows is a sequence so brutal that the show was widely accused on first broadcast of having lied to its own audience about what kind of show it was. The cartoon premise had let people in. The first episode opened like a coming-of-age story about a kid getting his powers. The first 3/4 of the episode followed that template. The audience was leaning into a familiar genre, and then a conference room full of superheroes was turned into a slaughterhouse by a man who had spent the entire preceding hour smiling at his son over breakfast. The shock was so loud in the immediate online response to the episode that the show's actual philosophical project was nearly buried under the noise of fans simply trying to process what they had seen. It is, in retrospect, one of the best opening hours of television in the last decade, and the reason it is so good is not the violence. The reason it is so good is the violence's relationship to the breakfast. The show, in those 48 minutes, made a philosophical claim about the way ordinary kindness coexists in the same body with the capacity for absolute violence, and it made the claim with so much craft that most of the audience did not realize the claim had been made. The claim is the second half of the philosophy of Omni-Man, and to see it clearly, you have to step inside the conference room with him. Their names are the Immortal, Red Rush, War Woman, Aquarius, Green Ghost, Darkwing, and Martian Man. The show has been careful to introduce each of them to you, briefly, across the preceding episodes. You know them as types more than as people. They are recognizable by design as half parodies of figures from the comic book tradition the show is in conversation with. Their familiarity is the point. The audience knows what a team of heroes like this is supposed to do in a story like this. They are supposed to assemble. They are supposed to face a threat. They are supposed to fight that threat, lose someone they love, regroup, win. The genre has a shape, and they are inside it, the way a wedding cake is inside an oven. Then the oven door opens, and the cake is removed. And the man who removes it is the one who was supposed to be the icing. He alerts them by their emergency communicators to gather at headquarters. They come. They are confused. They ask why they have been called. He does not answer. He attacks the Immortal first because the Immortal is the strongest. He misses because Red Rush, who is fast enough to almost outrun the moment, sees the strike coming and saves the Immortal with a blink of motion that is so fast the show animates it as a still frame. Red Rush is the second fastest being in the room. The fastest is the one trying to kill them. The fastest catches Red Rush by the wrist, the way a man might catch a child trying to run past him in a hallway, and crushes his skull. The other Guardians watch. The fight is on. It is worth pausing here on what the show is doing with the choreography of this scene, because the choreography is the philosophy. Every other Guardian dies in a particular way. Martian Man is torn apart. Aquarius is bludgeoned to death with War Woman's mace. After she is already dead, Darkwing is slammed against the floor until his head explodes. Green Ghost is killed mid-catch as she tries to break her teammate's fall. War Woman is broken at the neck. The Immortal, weakly conscious, asks Omni-Man what drove him. Nolan does not answer. The Immortal is decapitated. The show, in its commentary on this sequence, has noted that in the comic version of the massacre, Omni-Man kills the Guardians easily and instantly, almost in passing. In the show version, by contrast, Nolan barely wins. He is gravely injured. He nearly dies. The room is so full of his blood at the end of the fight that the next time the Guardians' replacement team enters the headquarters, they spend a meaningful amount of screen time scrubbing him out of the carpet. This change matters, because the change is the philosophy. The comic version was a demonstration of strength. The show version is a demonstration of cost. The doctrine of Viltrumite supremacy is being tested in that conference room against an actual room full of people who do not want to die. The doctrine wins, but only barely. Nolan has to spend in that room almost everything he has. He has to nearly die to do what the doctrine demanded. And he does it anyway because the doctrine is louder in that moment than the body. It is impossible to watch this scene and not be reminded of one of the most discussed ideas in 20th century moral philosophy, which is Hannah Arendt's argument about the banality of evil. Arendt watched the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat who had organized the logistics of the deportation of millions of human beings to their deaths, and her account of him was one of the most disturbing things written in the 20th century. She did not find him impressive. She did not find him passionate. She did not find him animated by hatred or ideology in any way that made him a recognizable monster. She found him instead to be a small, ordinary man who had been competent at a particular job and who had not, in any meaningful way, thought about the job while he was doing it. He had done what was expected of him, the way a clerk processes paperwork. The evil, in her phrase, was banal, not in the sense of small, in the sense of unthinking. The horror of Eichmann was that the worst acts in history could be carried out by someone who never paused, even once, to ask whether he should be carrying them out. The reason this idea is worth bringing up in the context of Omni-Man is that the show is doing something very smart with it. Nolan Grayson is not Eichmann. Nolan Grayson is something more complicated. He is not unthinking. He has thought about what he is doing. He has thought about it for years while raising a son and loving a wife and keeping his cover. And the result of his thinking has been to arrive again and again at the same doctrine he was given as a child. Because the doctrine was given to him in a way that made all alternative thoughts feel like errors, the show's claim, which is harder to live with than Arendt's, is that you can think hard about a doctrine and still be inside it if the doctrine was the air you were breathing during the years when you learned how to think. Nolan is not banal. Nolan is sincere. The horror, in his case, is not that the evil was thoughtless. The horror is that the evil was thought about by a competent and reflective adult, and it survived the thinking. This is the thing that almost no version of this story in any medium gets right, and the thing that Invincible gets right on purpose. The doctrine wins not because the man inside it is stupid. The doctrine wins because the doctrine has had longer to think than the man has. It is older than him. It has anticipated his objections. It has folded his earliest doubts into its earliest formulations, and by the time he is sophisticated enough to question any of it, every question he can imagine asking has already been answered, in advance, by an institutional voice that has had thousands of years to perfect its replies. This is what a real doctrine sounds like. It is not a slogan. It is a whole interior architecture which a person inhabits the way a fish inhabits water, and which only becomes visible when the person, by some unlikely accident, is briefly lifted out. The unlikely accident, in Nolan's case, is the dinner that follows the massacre. He goes home, he has just killed 7 people, he is, by his own account, wounded. He bandages himself, he takes a shower, and then, in a moment that the show holds for slightly longer than feels comfortable, he sits down at his family's dinner table and asks his wife what they are having to eat. Debbie, who does not know what he has just done, answers normally. Mark, who does not know what his father has just done, talks about his day. The camera lingers on Nolan's face. He is participating in the conversation. He is making eye contact. He is asking follow-up questions. He is, in every measurable way, a husband and a father at a family dinner. And the doctrine that has just animated him through the deaths of 7 of his colleagues is silent. The doctrine has nothing to say about dinner. The doctrine does not know what to do with a wife who has microwaved meatloaf. The doctrine in the kitchen becomes inert. What you are watching in that scene is a man whose internal architecture has 2 completely separate floors that have never in his memory been on the same elevator. The top floor is the doctrine. It has flags and battle plans and a long list of things the strong owe the weak. The bottom floor is the kitchen. It has meatloaf and a wife's hand on his shoulder and a son trying to figure out how to ask for a ride somewhere. The man takes the elevator between floors several times a day. He does not, until the events of the 8th episode, have any reason to notice that the 2 floors are not in the same building. He moves between them by habit. He is, in his own life, 2 people, sharing 1 mustache. This is a more honest description of how most people actually live with their stated philosophies than most people would like to admit. You probably do this too. You have things you believe in some abstract way about how the world ought to be, and you have ways you actually behave in your daily life. And the 2 are often not the same thing, and the discrepancy is usually invisible to you, because you have never been asked to do both on the same afternoon. Most lives are designed to keep the philosophical floor and the kitchen floor separated. Most institutions exist to maintain that separation. School is one place, work is another, home is a third, and the values that govern each are usually free to contradict the values of the others without anyone ever having to publicly notice. You can spend Tuesday running a meeting at a corporation whose practices, if you thought about them carefully, would make you uneasy. And you can spend Tuesday night reading bedtime stories to a child you would die for. And the contradiction can survive in you for decades. Because the elevator between the 2 floors does not stop on the floor where the contradiction would be visible. What the show does to Nolan, with surgical patience, is force him to put both floors on the same elevator, not all at once. Slowly, through the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th episodes of the 1st season, the show introduces small frictions. A moment where his colleague's death affects his son. A moment where his cover identity overlaps awkwardly with his actual mission. A moment where Debbie asks a question whose honest answer would unmake the marriage. The frictions accumulate. He answers them each time by retreating to one floor or the other. He goes upstairs to the doctrine. He goes downstairs to the kitchen. He never until the 8th episode has to stand on both floors at once. In the 8th episode, he is asked to. The immortal, resurrected by the Mahler twins, returns to public life. The new Guardians of the Globe are being assembled. Cecil Stedman, the head of the Global Defense Agency, is closing in on the truth. And Mark, the son Nolan has been training, has now become powerful enough to count as a meaningful asset, or as a meaningful threat. The doctrine requires Nolan to act. The kitchen requires him to be the man he has been for 20 years. The 2 floors are being summoned to the same elevator at the same time, and the man inside the elevator has to make a choice that he has spent his entire adult life arranging never to have to make. He chooses the doctrine. He kills the immortal again, this time in public in front of his son. He explains on camera who he really is. He tells Mark to join him or to die. He flies them both to Chicago, where the most physically destructive fight in the show's history takes place across multiple city blocks, and where a great many ordinary human beings are killed for no reason other than to be killed near enough to a Viltrumite to count as proof of his point. The fight is not really a fight. It is a sermon. He is preaching the doctrine using the only language the doctrine understands, which is bodies. He is showing his son, with violence as the visual aid, what the doctrine looks like when it is allowed to express itself fully. He is asking Mark to convert. The doctrine, in his understanding, is the highest argument he has. If his son hears it clearly, in its fullest expression, Mark will see what Nolan sees. Mark will join. The math will work out. The 500 years that lie ahead of them will be 500 years of useful conquest, side by side, in the empire they were born to. The audience, watching this, can already see the mistake. The doctrine, expressed at full volume, is not persuading anyone. It is destroying everyone in earshot, including, eventually, the man preaching it. Because the doctrine cannot acknowledge the kitchen, and Mark, by being the kitchen made into a person, is something the doctrine has no available move against. Mark is not arguing back. Mark is just being there, with his face, while his father tells him that his planet does not count. The doctrine has no counter to the face. The doctrine, when it meets a face it cannot bring itself to break, begins, finally, to crack. What cracks it open, completely, is a single sentence delivered in a near whisper by a son with his ribs broken, in the wreckage of a train station. The sentence is the answer to a question Nolan did not realize he was asking. The question is the one that will define for the rest of his life the philosophy he has actually been living all along. The question is, what will you have after 500 years? It is delivered by Nolan, on his knees, in tears, into the face of his bleeding son. The full version, for anyone who has not memorized it, goes like this. Why did you make me do this? You are fighting so you can watch everyone around you die. Think, Mark. You will outlast every fragile, insignificant being on this planet. You will live to see this world crumble to dust and blow away. Everyone and everything you know will be gone. What will you have after 500 years? It is a serious question. It is asked, in that moment, with what is unmistakably real grief. And it is the question the Empire has been asking itself, in some version, for thousands of years. It is the question that allowed the Empire to become the Empire. Because the answer the Empire arrived at after enough generations is that you will have nothing. That if you live long enough, the things you love will all die before you, and the love you spent on them will be revealed to have been a loan you can never get back. That attachment is a kind of debt. That every person you let yourself care about is, in advance, a future grief, scheduled. And that the only rational response to this discovery is to refuse the attachment, to harden the heart in advance, to spend your eons on a project bigger than any one love, like an empire, like a doctrine, like the long, cold, unending work of bringing order to a galaxy that is otherwise just an enormous storehouse of brief, beautiful, doomed creatures, whose deaths will all hurt you if you let any of them in. This is the philosophy the Empire has built around the long lifespan. It is, in its own way, an attempt at a coherent answer to a real problem. The problem is genuine. If you are going to live for thousands of years and the people around you are going to live for less than one, then the math of attachment really does start to look unmanageable. You will mourn and mourn and mourn. You will outlive every face. You will become a museum of grief. The doctrine, faced with this prospect, proposes a solution. Refuse the attachment. Keep the eons. Build something that will last. Become an empire. Become a function. Stop being a person who has people and become an institution that has subjects. Now, here is what Mark says in that train station, with his ribs broken and his mouth full of blood. He says, "You, Dad, I would still have you." It is worth slowing down on this answer, because it is doing more philosophical work than it gets credit for. The first thing it does is refuse the premise of the question. The question assumes that after 500 years, every person Mark loves will be gone. Mark answers by naming the one person in the room who is also a Viltrumite, the one person the math does not apply to. Mark is saying very gently that his father is wrong about who he is going to lose. Mark is saying that he intends to keep his father. The 500 years are not a problem if you are spending them with each other. The second thing the answer does is refuse the doctrine's metaphysics. The doctrine treats meaning as something that can be added up over time, the way distance is added up over miles. 500 years of meaning divided by however many human lives gives you a per-life meaning quotient, which is, by the doctrine's accounting, small enough to round to zero. Mark's answer denies this entire framework, meaning in his answer is not a quantity that gets diluted by time. It is something that gets generated locally in the encounter between people who care about each other. The encounter is the meaning. It does not need to be conserved across centuries to count. It does not need to leave a residue. It does not need to be permanent. It needs to be real. And it is real now. And the now in which it is real is not made less real by the future in which it will end. This is, in fact, one of the oldest and most contested ideas in moral philosophy. And Mark, on the floor of that train station, has stated it with a clarity that several thousand years of professional philosophers have spent careers trying to articulate. The Stoics, in their best moments, argued for a version of this. They said that the value of the present moment is not contingent on its persistence. The fact that the rose will wilt does not make the rose less beautiful while it is in bloom. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private notebook that everything we love is dust before we ever get to love it, and that this is not a reason to love less. It is a reason to love now. The Stoic argument, properly understood, is not the cold detachment people associate with the word. It is something almost the opposite. It is a precise instruction to inhabit the moment you are actually in, because the moment you are actually in is the only one you ever get. Epicurus, from a slightly different tradition, made the same argument with different vocabulary. He said that death is nothing to us, because when death is present, we are not. And when we are present, death is not. The argument was meant to free people from the paralysis of dreading endings. The ending, when it arrives, is not something you will experience. You will be done experiencing. The fear of the ending while you are still alive is a kind of bad accounting. You are paying interest in the present on a debt that will only be called in when you are no longer there to pay it. The Epicurean recommendation is to stop the interest payments, to live in the time you have without prepaying its loss. Lucretius, who carried this line of thought forward in his long poem On the Nature of Things, added one more wrinkle, which is the wrinkle that applies most directly to Nolan's situation. He said, "Imagine the millennia that passed before your birth. Imagine all the eons during which you did not exist. They do not trouble you. You do not mourn them. They feel to you like nothing at all. Now," he said, "look at the eons that will follow your death. They are the mirror of the eons before your birth. There is no reason by symmetry to dread the second more than you dread the first. Both are equally not yours. Your portion is the time between. The time between is enough." The Viltrumite doctrine, which treats the long lifespan as a curse that justifies emotional armor, has gotten this exactly wrong. The long lifespan is not a problem unless you treat your existence as a ledger that must balance. Mark, who has not read any of these philosophers and is making the argument from scratch, in the time between two punches, has nonetheless arrived at the same conclusion. The years he will spend with his father, however many they turn out to be, are the years he will spend with his father. They will not be made less by the years after. They will not be made less by the deaths of his classmates or by the wilting of the planet or by the end of the species he was raised inside. They will be what they are while he is in them. And then Mark says one more thing in that scene, with his blood on his father's hands, and it is the thing that breaks the doctrine completely. He says that he has seen his father save people. He has seen him almost die to protect them. He says, maybe you were a Viltrumite when you came to Earth, but you have changed. You were happy here. This is a description of his father, and the description, by being true, makes the doctrine impossible to hold any longer. Because the doctrine claims that attachment is a contamination, an error, a softness imposed on Viltrumite hardware by an inferior planet. But Nolan, by Mark's accurate account, has been happy. The doctrine has no available response to happiness. The doctrine can argue against pleasure, against pity, against affection. It cannot argue against the simple observed fact that a Viltrumite has spent 20 years on Earth and has been, by all visible measures, a man enjoying his life. If the doctrine were true, this should not have been possible. The doctrine should have insulated Nolan from happiness the way the doctrine insulates him from grief, but it did not. Earth got past the doctrine. And the man who is now monologuing in a train station demanding that his son explain how attachment can possibly survive 500 years is in fact the living proof that the Empire's central claim about emotional armor is false. He is the proof. He is also the proof's executioner, because the same fist that he is holding to his son's face is the fist of a man who has, by his own visible behavior, refuted everything he has been raised to believe. And he knows it, not all at once, not on the surface, but somewhere underneath the doctrine, in the part of him that has been quietly accumulating attachment in defiance of the official manual. He knows it. The 500-year question was the doctrine's last attempt to make him forget. And the answer, you, Dad, was the moment the forgetting failed. There is a quieter version of this same exchange that the show stages, with great care throughout the rest of the season and the seasons that follow. Every time Nolan tries to restate the doctrine, the show stages a small humiliation for him. He says he does not care about humans. The show cuts to him saving a human. He says he is loyal only to Viltrum. The show cuts to him weeping at the edge of a black hole. He says the Empire is the only family he has needed. The show cuts to him whispering, alone, in a coalition cell, that he thinks he misses his wife. The doctrine, over the course of the show, becomes a script he keeps trying to perform and keeps fumbling. Not because he is a bad actor, because the role no longer fits the man. What you are watching, across the show, is the doctrine being slowly evicted. It does not leave all at once. It has been Nolan's only philosophy for centuries. It has been the air he breathed inside the womb of an empire that lectured him on strength before he could speak. You do not get rid of that kind of programming in a single conversation. Even a conversation with your son in a destroyed train station. Even a conversation that ends with you crying on his blood. The doctrine survives the train station. It survives the next few weeks. It survives the suicide attempt, in some form. But the train station begins the eviction. The train station is the moment the doctrine's lease, in Nolan's interior architecture, is no longer renewable. He just has not been served the paperwork yet. The other thing the train station does, which deserves its own quiet attention, is shift the audience's understanding of who Mark Grayson is. Up until this episode, Mark has been positioned as a teenage hero in over his head, a nice kid with powers learning the job. After the train station, Mark is positioned as something else entirely. Not stronger, not braver, wiser. The philosophical victory of that scene belongs entirely to Mark. He is the one who has the right answer to the question of how to live with a long life and ongoing love. He is the one who, at 17 years old, has correctly identified what his father, at several hundred years old, has spent his entire existence avoiding. The father has the muscle. The son has the philosophy. And the show, very gently, in the years that follow, lets you watch the father catch up. The other thing worth saying about this whole sequence is that it works as a piece of writing in a way that almost no superhero scene in the genre's modern history has worked. Most superhero monologues are bad. Most are written to be quoted later, in marketing materials by people who have not thought about whether the monologue actually contains an argument. The 500-year speech contains an argument. The answer to the speech contains a counter-argument. The counter-argument wins on the merits without any of the usual cheats. There is no deus ex machina. There is no sudden change of heart. There is no last-minute revelation that the villain was secretly mind-controlled. There is just a man asking the wrong question, getting the right answer from his son, and beginning very slowly in real time to notice that he has been wrong his entire life. And then he flies away, and the most powerful being on the planet, who has just defeated his only meaningful opposition and could now finish the conquest of Earth in an afternoon if he wanted to, instead leaves. He looks at his hands. He sees his son's blood. He weeps. He goes into space. And the Empire's most distant deployment, a one-man advance team that has spent 20 years preparing a world for absorption, abandons the mission mid-flight because of a sentence delivered by a child. The Doctrine, in that moment, has no available explanation for what just happened. The Doctrine has trained for every contingency except this one. It has trained for resistance. It has trained for defeat. It has trained for retreat. It has never trained for a Viltrumite to walk away from a successful conquest because his son said something true. The Doctrine's databanks have no entry for that move. The move was not anticipated. The Doctrine, faced with the Viltrumite making the move, can only sputter. And what happens next in the months following the Chicago fight is what a man does when his entire interior architecture has just developed a crack he cannot ignore. And he is alone, in the dark, with no instructions. The crack opens first in the seconds after Mark answers him. Watch the scene again if you have a copy of it nearby. Pay attention not to Mark, who is on the ground barely conscious, and not to the city, which is on fire, but to Nolan's face in the half second after his son says, "You, Dad, I would still have you." The face does not do what a villain's face is supposed to do in a moment like this. It does not snarl, it does not roll its eyes, it does not pivot to a closing argument. It freezes, the mouth opens, slightly, as if a word were forming and then could not finish. The eyes move fractionally from Mark's face to Mark's blood, which is on Nolan's own hands. The hands, in close-up, hold the blood like they are seeing the blood for the first time. The Doctrine in the architecture upstairs is still trying to talk. The hands in the kitchen downstairs have stopped listening. What is happening on that face in philosophical terms is something Sartre wrote about with great precision in the middle of the last century. He called it being for others. The idea is this: you experience yourself most of the time as a subject, a perspective, a point from which the world is seen. Then, occasionally, you become aware that someone else is also experiencing you, but as an object, a face in their world, a thing they are looking at. That awareness is a small earthquake every time it happens. You suddenly are not just a perspective. You are also a thing that has a perspective looking at it. You see yourself briefly from outside. The version of you that lives in the other person's eyes is not always the version of you that lives in your own. Sometimes the gap is large enough to make you sick. What Mark's answer does to Nolan is open that gap to its widest possible setting. Nolan has spent the entire fight as a subject. He has been the one speaking the doctrine, applying its conclusions, executing its will. He has been the perspective. Mark, until the answer, has been the object, a target, an audience, a piece of debris in the doctrine's path. Then Mark speaks, and Mark, by speaking, does something the doctrine cannot survive. He puts Nolan into Mark's eyes. He makes Nolan see himself from the place where Mark is standing. And the version of Nolan that lives in Mark's eyes at that moment is not the version Nolan has been speaking from. The version in Mark's eyes is a man who has loved his son for 17 years and is now breaking his son's bones in a city, while crying while explaining why this is reasonable. The doctrine cannot survive being looked at from that angle. The doctrine works only as long as the doctrine is the only camera. The moment a second camera arrives, the doctrine is exposed. That is why Nolan looks at his hands. The hands are the place where the two cameras can be reconciled or cannot. The hands are the evidence. They are wet with the blood of a person he has been calling a project. They are wet, specifically with the blood of a person whose forehead he has kissed, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday, sometime in the last decade. The doctrine has a story about hands like these. The doctrine says the hands are doing necessary work. They are clearing a path. They are removing an obstruction to the Empire's plan. They are not, the doctrine insists, hurting anyone who matters. They are doing their job. The hands, on screen, do not appear to agree with the doctrine's story. The hands appear to be in a state of betrayal. They have just done something the man attached to them has, until this moment, been able to convince himself was something else. He raises off the ground, he looks at Mark, he does not finish him. He should. By every internal metric the doctrine has provided, this is the obvious move. Finish him. Continue with the conquest. Make another son later. There is plenty of time. The doctrine itself, earlier in the fight, suggested this option in one of the most chilling lines the show has ever delivered. Earlier in the train station, Nolan said to Mark, "You want to die for this planet? Fine. What is 17 more years? I can always start again, make another kid." This was, internal to the doctrine, a coherent statement. Sons are replaceable. The Empire's project is bigger than any single child. Mark is a unit in a long-term program. Units are interchangeable. The math, if you accept the doctrine, works. The math does not work. The man holding the math down, even in the moment of speaking it, was already failing to convince himself. You can see it in the line's delivery. Listen, if you have the audio, the line is not delivered with the easy conviction of a man stating an obvious truth. It is delivered with a slight, almost imperceptible pause before "make another kid," as if the line had to be assembled in real time out of pieces the assembler did not entirely trust. The doctrine wrote the line, the man read it aloud. The reading sounded to anyone listening carefully like a man reading aloud from a manual whose authority he had begun to doubt. The "making another kid" line is also a small, terrible piece of evidence about what 20 years on Earth have done to Nolan. Because the line, in being said, is meant to convince Mark that Nolan does not care about him. The line fails for two reasons. The first reason is that Mark does not believe it. Mark, on the ground, listening, hears the line for what it is: a man trying to talk himself out of his own life. The second reason is more devastating. The line fails because, even as Nolan says it, the line is wrong about Nolan. He cannot, in fact, start again. He has tried. He's been on Earth for 20 years. He has spent 2 decades attempting internally to keep his distance from this family while officially performing fatherhood. He has not succeeded. Mark is not replaceable. Mark is the actual son of a man who has, against his entire training, become a father. To say "I can always start again" is to confess, in the form of a denial, that the current start is not the rehearsal. The current start is the real one. There is no other Mark waiting in the Empire's roster. There is only this one. And killing this one would not lead to a fresh Mark. It would lead to no Mark. And no Mark is something the man who said the line, on hearing himself say it, cannot bring himself to do. So he does not finish him. He looks at Mark, he looks at his hands, he weeps, he flies away. While he does this, the camera cuts, very briefly, to a room you should remember. The Global Defense Agency monitor room. Debbie Grayson is in the room. She has been watching the entire fight on a screen. She has heard every word. She has heard, in particular, the line where her husband, the man she has been married to for 20 years, told their son that she was, quote, more like a pet. The camera holds on her face while she processes this. She does not scream, she does not faint. She sits and her face becomes a face you have never quite seen on a wife in a superhero show before. It is not heartbroken. Heartbreak is too clean a word for what is happening on her face. It is the look of a person who has just been informed by an unimpeachable source that the last 20 years of her life were not, in some technical respect, what she thought they were. This look in subsequent episodes will become the spine of Debbie's character arc. She will spend the entire second season trying to figure out what to do with the information she just received. She will drink, she will rage, she will try to reconstruct her life from the rubble. She will arrive eventually at a verdict on her husband that is more nuanced than the one she could have offered in the immediate aftermath. But in that moment, in that monitor room, she has been handed an impossible philosophical assignment. She has been told that the man she loves her like a pet, and she has to decide whether that means the love was fake, or whether that means the man's idea of love is broken, or whether that means his idea of pet is closer to what she means by spouse than he realizes. She cannot finish that decision in a single afternoon. The show, to its great credit, lets her not finish it. She works on it across episodes. She works on it across years. The work is not concluded by the end of any season. The pet line, like the make another kid line, is one of those moments in the show that deserves its own quiet attention because it tells you something important about the Doctrine's relationship to language. The Doctrine has a vocabulary problem. The Doctrine, having been built by a species that does not believe in attachment, does not have good words for the kinds of attachment a person can develop against the Doctrine's wishes. Nolan, in trying to describe his actual feelings about Debbie, reaches for the words the Doctrine has available. The closest word the Doctrine has for a being you have lived with for 2 decades and felt warmth toward and protected from harm is pet. The word is wrong. The word is terrible. The word is the best the Doctrine could give him. He uses it because it is the only word he has been issued for what he actually feels. He does not realize, in using it, that the feeling he is trying to describe has already outgrown the word. He thinks he is dismissing his wife. He is actually, with the wrong vocabulary, admitting that he has spent 20 years experiencing something the Empire's dictionary cannot name. The eviction of the Doctrine, then, is not just an emotional event. It is also a linguistic one. Nolan, after Mark's answer, has been given evidence that the Doctrine's words do not match the world. He has called his wife a pet, but his wife is not a pet, and the part of him that knows this has been growing for years without being allowed to speak. He has called his son a project, but his son is not a project. And the proof of this is currently lying in a pool of blood on a piece of broken concrete and answering the Doctrine's central question better than the Doctrine has ever been able to answer it. He has called Earth a planet to be softened, but the planet has, in the gentlest possible way, softened him. The words are wrong. The vocabulary needs to be replaced, and there is no Viltrumite dictionary anywhere in the Empire that has the right ones in stock. So he flies away. Not in retreat, exactly. Not in defeat, exactly. In something closer to a kind of lexical emergency. He has run out of words. He needs new ones. He cannot find them on Earth, because Earth is the place where his son and his wife are, and being near them, in his current state, would require speech he does not have. He cannot find them on Viltrum, because Viltrum is the place where the old vocabulary was issued, and going back would just refresh his stock of the wrong words. He needs a place that is neither, a place that is silent, a place where the Doctrine has no studio and the kitchen has no chair. He needs space. He needs the long indifferent black between the colonies, where no one is asking him to define anything. He spends the next several months there. The show does not show all of it. It shows him drifting. It shows him alone, with nothing to do, in a place that does not require him to make any decisions. He has, by his own internal accounting, become a being without a function. He has abandoned his post. He has refused his orders. He has not finished his conquest. He is also no longer the husband, no longer the father, no longer the colleague. He is not in any official sense anything. The Empire has not yet caught up to him, which means the Empire's verdict on him is not yet legible, which means he does not yet know what the Empire intends to do with the news that one of its operatives has, mid-mission, gone mute and gone home, or rather, gone away from home, because home is the place he cannot bear to return to. He is a man without a category. The Doctrine has no word for this either. He floats. This is the part of his arc that most analyses skip past on their way to the next plot point, and it is, in fact, the most philosophically loaded part of his entire character. Because what he does next, in the silence, is the actual test of his soul. The train station is the test of his loyalty. The black hole is the test of his existence, and the choice he makes at the black hole is the one that defines what kind of philosophy he has actually been carrying, all along, underneath the doctrine. He drifts. The black hole is not in the show named or located in any way that makes it identifiable on a star chart. It is just there, in the dark, with the particular awful gravity that black holes have. He approaches it slowly. He does not engage his powers to resist the pull. He does not try to fly out. He does not appear to be afraid. He looks instead like a man who has identified in the largest object available, a resting place. The black hole is not a goal. The black hole is an exit, and he is taking it. Albert Camus, in a long essay published in 1942 called The Myth of Sisyphus, argued that the most important philosophical question a person can ever ask is whether to keep living. He said that all other questions, no matter how serious they appear, are downstream of this one. Camus framed it in his own dramatic way. He said that the absurd, by which he meant the gap between our desire for meaning and the universe's apparent refusal to provide any, raises the question of suicide as the only serious philosophical problem. He did not, in saying this, recommend suicide. He recommended the opposite. He recommended that the question be confronted honestly and then refused on its own terms, and that the refusal of suicide be the foundation of every subsequent decision a person makes. The famous final image of the essay is Sisyphus, the mythological figure condemned to push a boulder up a hill forever, smiling at his fate. Camus' claim was that the only meaningful response to the absurd is to choose to keep pushing the boulder, knowing the boulder will roll back down, knowing the work is endless, and to find in the choosing something that the universe cannot take away. The choosing is the meaning. The choosing is the philosophy. Nolan, at the edge of the black hole, is being asked Camus' question for the first time in his life. He has never been asked it before. The doctrine did not allow it. The doctrine assigned him a function and a sequence of objectives, and a long list of acceptable performance metrics. And the question of whether to keep living was not, internally, an open one, because the function had to keep being performed, and the metrics had to keep being met. A Viltrumite does not ask whether to keep living. A Viltrumite has a mission. The mission is the keeping living. The question in Viltrumite culture is not coherent. Now, for the first time, he is in a place where the question is not just coherent, but loud. He has no mission, he has no orders. He has just abandoned the only philosophy that ever supplied him with reasons. There is nothing, at this moment, requiring him to remain in existence. The black hole is the universe asking him whether he wants to. He almost says no. The drift is the no. The body is the no. He is not flying toward the black hole the way a hero flies toward danger. He is allowing the black hole to have him, the way a tired swimmer allows the tide to take him out. Then, the ship enters the frame. It is a Thraxan vessel. The Thraxans are an insectoid species the show introduces, in the second season, as a small civilization out in the same lonely region of space where Nolan has been drifting. The ship is damaged. The ship is full of passengers. The ship is on the same trajectory Nolan is on, drawn by the same gravity, headed for the same exit. The ship's occupants did not choose to be on this trajectory. Their ship broke. They are being pulled in. They will, in another few seconds, cease to exist. Nolan has to decide what to do. This is the most quietly important decision in the entire show. The doctrine, if it had any voice left, would not have to think about it. The Thraxans, by the doctrine's reckoning, are inferior beings. Weak. Brief. Not worth the calories. Their loss is a rounding error. Even saving them would not, in the doctrine's accounting, be a notable act of heroism. It would be charity, which the doctrine views as a category error. The doctrine has nothing to gain from the Thraxans living. The doctrine has nothing to lose from the Thraxans dying. The doctrine, applied to this moment, would tell Nolan to keep drifting. He saves them. He breaks his trajectory, catches the ship, redirects it, carries the survivors back to their home planet. He becomes, in the act of doing this, something other than a Viltrumite drifting toward a black hole. He becomes a person who has done a thing for someone else. And then, because of the strange administrative rules of Thraxan society, he becomes their ruler, not by conquest, by accident of biology. The oldest living being on Thraxa is, by tradition, the Emperor. Thraxans live for only a few months. Nolan, by Thraxan standards, is older than the entire history of their civilization. They look at him. They make him king. The crown is offered in gratitude, not extracted in force. He accepts. The reign that follows is the strangest passage in the entire show, because it is not really a reign. It is something more like a retirement. He is not conquering anyone. He is not preparing for war. He is governing a small population of brief insectoid beings who treat him with affection rather than fear, and whose entire civilization, when he meets them, is on the brink of collapse. He helps them rebuild. He attends to their problems. He learns slowly how to be a ruler who is not the ruler the doctrine trained him to be. The doctrine, on the surface of his mind, is still arguing. Why are you doing this? What is the strategic value of these people? What is the long-term plan? He does not answer the doctrine. He does not have to. He is no longer a Viltrumite officer on assignment. He is a man on a planet taking care of the people who live there. The function has been replaced by something the function would not have known how to describe. While he is doing this, he meets Andressa. Andressa is a Thraxan. She is voiced in the show by Rhea Seehorn. She is, by the show's careful framing, not a stand-in for Debbie, and not a rebound and not a pet. The framing is important, because the doctrine, if it had been present in Nolan's selection of a second partner, would have produced exactly the kinds of relationships the doctrine has always produced. It wouldn't have produced a strategic alliance or a controlled production or a calculated bond that conferred specific advantages. The relationship with Andressa is none of those things. It is something stranger. It is a relationship that begins, on Nolan's side, with no doctrine in the room. He has lost the doctrine. He has lost his old vocabulary. He has, at this point in the story, no plan at all. And in the absence of the plan, he meets a woman, and she meets him, and the meeting becomes a marriage. Quietly, without administrative justification. Andressa, importantly, is not stronger than Nolan. She is, in fact, by every metric the doctrine cared about, weaker. She is brief. She is fragile. She will be dead, in human terms, within a few short years. The doctrine, presented with her, would call her a pet. The doctrine would be wrong twice. It would be wrong because she is not a pet. It would also be wrong, more interestingly, because the doctrine was wrong about the first marriage too, and Nolan this time knows it. The first marriage failed not because Debbie was a pet. The first marriage failed because Nolan, while inside the doctrine, could not see her as anything else. With Andressa, the doctrine is no longer dictating his vocabulary. He calls her his wife, and the word means, this time, what the word is supposed to mean. He has learned the long way around, the difference between the two relationships, and the difference is not located in the women. The difference is located in the man. The first time, the man was a Viltrumite officer who happened to be living as a husband. The second time, the man is a husband who happens to have a complicated past. They have a son. His name is Oliver. He is a Viltrumite Thraxan hybrid. He is, in the show, an active and lively child, voiced first by Lincoln Bowden and later by Christian Convery, with the distinctive purple skin the comics gave him to mark his hybrid nature. Oliver is not a project. Oliver is not a strategic asset. Oliver is, in the only word the doctrine never had, a kid. Nolan, in the brief time he has with Oliver before the show pulls him in other directions, behaves toward him in a way that the doctrine would not recognize. He is gentle. He is amused by him. He picks him up and holds him without checking, first, whether this is consistent with the Empire's policies on physical intimacy with offspring. The intimacy itself is the answer. The intimacy was always the answer. The Empire's whole misunderstanding of love has been to assume that love, examined closely enough, would turn out to be transactional. It is not. The intimacy is its own reason. This is the part of his arc where you can finally see the philosophy of Omni-Man in its mature form, with the doctrine fully evicted and the new vocabulary partially installed. The philosophy by this point is something like this. Attachment is not a weakness. Attachment is the entire ground on which a life can be built. The strong are not the people who refuse attachment. The strong are the people who can survive its inevitable losses without renouncing the practice. The Empire was wrong, not in its assessment of how much grief love causes, but in its assumption that grief was a reason to stop loving. The Empire had the math correct and the conclusion exactly backwards. Yes, you will outlive the people you love. Yes, the grief will be enormous. Yes, the long life is, in some respects, a structural setup for repeated heartbreak. None of this argues against attachment. All of this argues in favor of it. Because the alternative, which is to live for centuries without loving anyone, is not a victory over grief. It is a surrender to a different and worse kind of damage. The Empire's emotionally armored existence is not invulnerability. It is a slow, dignified internal death, dressed up in a uniform. You see this philosophy land in him in pieces over the next 2 seasons. You see it land when he watches the Viltrumites arrive on Thraxa to drag him home. You see it land when he chooses to defend Mark and Oliver and Andressa, knowing he cannot win, knowing the Empire's enforcers are stronger than he is in his current state, knowing that the only available outcome of resistance is his own capture. He fights anyway. He fights because the philosophy by this point has taught him that the version of him who would not fight is the version of him who is already dead. The fight ends with his capture. He is taken away by Viltrumite enforcers. Mark, freshly devastated, watches him go. Before he is dragged off the planet, Nolan says one last thing to Mark. It is not a speech. It is not a philosophical summary. It is 4 words. Read my books, Mark. Read my books. These books, the audience knows, are the travel books Nolan was once said to write as part of his cover identity. The audience assumed for several seasons that the books were a cover, that they were a fiction maintained for credibility, like a businessman's title on a business card. The line about reading them implies something different. It implies that the books are not just a cover. The books contain something. Information, observations, coded testimony. The man who once was assigned to write fake travel guides as part of an undercover assignment turned out, somewhere along the way, to be actually writing, to be a man who took notes, to be a man with truths he was preserving. The line, in retrospect, is the final tear in the doctrine, because the doctrine had no use for books. The doctrine did not record. The doctrine repeated itself. The man who, in his final moments on Thraxa, points his son toward his own writings, has revealed that the journey from Viltrumite officer to author was already complete. He has, in private, been writing his own philosophy for years. He has been thinking. He has been arriving at conclusions. He has been saving them in a form that could be passed on to the people who would need them after he was gone. He is the Empire's first sleeper agent to have turned in mid-mission into a journalist of his own conversion. The philosophy of Omni-Man in its final and most complete form is the philosophy of a man who tried both available options and learned, the hard way, that only one of them does not destroy you. The 2 options were, on one hand, the Empire's prescribed life of detachment, mastery, and conquest, in which you do not love and therefore cannot lose, and in which you trade your interior life for an exterior empire. On the other hand, the strange, undisciplined, slightly embarrassing practice of caring about specific people in front of you, knowing that they will die, knowing that you will mourn, knowing that you have no defense, and doing it anyway. Nolan tried the first one for centuries. He tried the second one, by accident, for 20 years on Earth. He chose, when the choice was finally placed in front of him at a black hole, to try the second one on purpose. He has spent the rest of his time on the show paying for the first choice, and slowly earning the right to keep making the second one. The philosophy is not a conclusion. The philosophy is a practice. He has the practice now, and he keeps it. And the Empire that raised him will spend the rest of the show, and the show's remaining seasons, trying to drag him back into the version of himself that the practice has retired. But there is a second person in this story whose relationship to the philosophy of Omni-Man is just as central as Nolan's, and whose fear of that philosophy is, in some ways, the show's most important argument. That person is Mark. The second season of Invincible, which the creator Robert Kirkman has said in interviews was structured explicitly around this question, places its entire thematic center on a single anxiety. The anxiety is whether Mark, by inheriting his father's powers, has also inherited his father's potential for violence. The anxiety is whether the doctrine, even though no one ever taught it to him in words, was somehow programmed into his Viltrumite DNA and is waiting, dormant, for the moment he loses control. The anxiety, in other words, is whether you can escape your father by trying to be a better version of him, or whether trying to be a better version of him is itself the road that leads, eventually, to being him. This is one of the oldest questions in moral philosophy, and it has been asked in different vocabularies by almost every tradition that ever sat down to think about what a person is. The Aristotelian version of the question is about hexis, which is the Greek word that gets translated as habit or character. Aristotle argued in the Nicomachean Ethics that virtue is not a feeling you have. Virtue is a habit you practice. The just person is not the person who has just feelings. The just person is the person who acts justly, often enough that acting justly has become the default. The unjust person is the same in reverse. They have practiced injustice long enough that injustice is the path of least resistance through their day. Character, in this view, is the accumulated residue of 1,000 small choices. You become what you repeatedly do. The fear, by extension, is that if you repeatedly do something terrible, even once, you might be on the way to becoming the kind of person for whom terrible things are easy. Mark in the second season is haunted by this fear. His father at the end of the previous season did terrible things in front of him with his hands while crying. Mark watched his father become, in real time, a person capable of those things. Mark is now, by every relevant biological metric, the same kind of being his father is. The same powers, the same constitution, the same access to a level of violence that, by ordinary human standards, is incomprehensible. The fear is not that Mark will choose to become his father. The fear is that the choice might already have been made in some preconscious chamber of his biology by an evolutionary inheritance that did not consult him. The fear is that the doctrine might not be just a doctrine. The fear is that the doctrine might be the user manual for a body, and that Mark, by being in the body, might be running the manual whether he reads it or not. The show takes this fear seriously enough to build an entire villain around it. The villain is named Angstrom Levy. He is a scientist who, through an experiment gone wrong, gains the ability to travel between alternate dimensions. He uses the ability, over the course of the season, to look at thousands of alternate versions of Mark Grayson. What he discovers in those alternate universes is something he cannot live with. Almost every alternate Mark in almost every alternate dimension has followed his father into conquest. Almost every alternate Mark has chosen, when the moment came, the Empire. The version of Mark in the Prime Dimension, the one the audience has been watching since the first episode, is a statistical outlier. He is one of the few across all possible universes who said no to his father. Most versions of him said yes. Most versions of him are now ruling the Earth alongside their fathers, or in some cases, instead of them, having killed Nolan to take his place. Angstrom Levy, having seen this multiversal pattern with his own eyes, becomes convinced that there is no good Mark, that the good Mark is a fluke, that the path of the doctrine is the gravitational default for a person born with Mark's powers, and that the only meaningful question is when, not whether, this Mark will fall into that default and become what the Empire was always going to make him. This is, on its face, a wildly unfair argument. It punishes Mark for what other versions of himself and universes he cannot influence have done. It treats him as a sample from a population whose other members are statistically guilty. It denies him, in advance, the credit for any actual choice he might make in his own life, because the choices have already been polled across the multiverse and the results have been entered into a spreadsheet. Angstrom Levy is, in the technical philosophical sense, committing a category error. He is treating a person as a probability distribution. He is asking Mark to account for himself not as a moral agent, but as a statistical anomaly. But the reason the show takes the argument seriously, even though it is unfair, is that Mark himself, in the deepest privacy of his own head, has been making the same argument against himself. Mark looks at his father's hands and sees his own. Mark notices in moments of stress that his strength is responding before his judgment is. Mark catches himself on more than one occasion across the season, hitting harder than he meant to, or taking longer than he should to pull a punch. The fear is not Angstrom Levy's. The fear is Mark's. Angstrom Levy is just the embodied, weaponized version of a fear Mark was already carrying around like an unexploded device in his chest. The show, with extraordinary cruelty, then arranges for Mark to confirm his own worst fear, on screen, with witnesses, in the finale of the second season. An episode aired in early April of 2024, titled, "With a Deliberate Cruelty All Its Own, I Thought You Were Stronger." The title is the line Omni-Man said to Mark on Thraxa when Mark refused to channel his inner Viltrumite. The title is Nolan's voice, embedded in the architecture of the episode, asking Mark whether he is going to be enough. In that episode, Angstrom Levy kidnaps Mark's mother and his half-brother. He sends Mark through several alternate dimensions, weakening him with each transit. He eventually corners Mark in a barren wasteland in a universe with no witnesses, and he taunts Mark very deliberately about Mark's family, about Debbie, about Oliver. Mark, after a season of holding back, after a season of trying not to be his father, after a season of fearing the moment when the doctrine inside him might finally clear its throat, snaps. He pins Angstrom Levy down, and he beats him to death. The scene is animated with a meticulous, unblinking attention to what is actually happening. The show does not stylize it. The show does not look away. The show holds the camera on Mark's hands, which are doing now exactly what Nolan's hands did in Chicago 3 years earlier in the show's chronology. And when it is over, Mark looks at his hands, looks at the blood, looks at the corpse, and whispers to the man he has just killed with what sounds like both grief and recognition, the line that haunts him. "I thought you were stronger." The line is his father's, and he says it the way his father said it. He has, in the act of speaking it, completed the inheritance. He has done the thing he was most afraid of doing. He has, in this moment, become a version of the man whose blood gave him his powers. What the show does next, in the remaining minutes of the episode and across the entire third season that follows, is the most philosophically interesting move it could have made. The show refuses to let the inheritance close the door on Mark. The show refuses to declare him doomed. The show instead gives him the only response to the inheritance that any philosophical tradition has ever recommended. The show makes him notice. He notices. He notices loudly. He notices in a way that breaks him mentally for the rest of the season. He becomes withdrawn. He becomes depressed. He quits college. He retreats. He goes to his mother and tells her in tears that he is leaving school because nothing he does there matters next to the question of whether he is becoming his father. The noticing is the whole point. The noticing is what saves him from being his father, because Nolan, for centuries, did not notice. Nolan acted inside the doctrine without ever stepping outside it to ask whether the doctrine was correct. Mark, at 17, after one act, has stepped outside. He is doing the very thing the doctrine forbade him to do. He is examining himself. This is the part of the show's philosophy that gets the least attention, and it is the most important part. The doctrine of the Empire works only on people who do not examine themselves. The moment a Viltrumite begins to notice his own actions as actions, the doctrine is over. The doctrine cannot survive an examined life. This is what Socrates was getting at 24 centuries earlier when he said that the unexamined life was not worth living. Socrates was not making an aesthetic recommendation. He was making a moral one. The examined life is the only life in which moral correction is possible, because the examined life is the only life in which the person living it has access to the data needed to course correct. The unexamined life proceeds on autopilot. It executes whatever doctrine was loaded into it at birth. It cannot, by definition, choose. Mark, by examining his moment of inheritance, has cracked the autopilot. He may inherit his father's powers. He may inherit his father's hands. He will not inherit his father's blindness. And that is the only inheritance in the end that mattered. There is a complementary tradition in Buddhist moral philosophy that says something very similar, in different vocabulary. The Buddhist concept of karma is often misunderstood in the West as a kind of cosmic punishment system. It is closer to the truth to say that karma, in its original Buddhist sense, refers to the accumulated weight of one's habits of mind. Every time you choose violence, the choice gets a little easier. Every time you choose compassion, the choice gets a little easier. Karma is the slow tuning of the instrument that is you by the music you have played on it. The point of Buddhist practice is not to be released from karma by some external act of grace. The point is to play different music, to practice the choices you want to be easier until they are, and to interrupt the habits you do not want when they arise by noticing them. The noticing is the key. The noticing is the only thing that ever changes anyone. Mark notices. He notices for the entire third season. He notices when the noticing makes him miserable. He notices when his friends do not understand why he has become so quiet. He notices when his teachers and his girlfriend and his mother all in different ways try to reassure him that the Angstrom Levy thing was a special case, that he was provoked, that he was justified. He listens to their reassurances. He keeps noticing anyway, because he knows, the way Nolan never did, that justification is the doctrine's favorite tool. Justification is what allowed Nolan to kill 7 of his friends, and then to come home and ask his wife about dinner. Justification is the architecture that makes the doctrine livable from the inside. To refuse justification is to refuse the doctrine, and to refuse the doctrine is to refuse to become the thing the doctrine would make of you. This is the inheritance question's actual answer. The question is whether Mark can escape becoming his father. The answer is not that Mark will or will not commit further acts of violence. Mark, by virtue of being a hero in a show about heroes, will commit further acts of violence. The answer is that Mark, after every act of violence, will examine the act. He will refuse, on principle, to develop a doctrine that explains why it was fine. He will keep noticing. The noticing is the escape. The noticing is the only escape. And the show, in giving Mark the noticing, has given him the thing his father never had, and the thing that, retroactively, became the deepest critique of his father possible. Nolan, for several hundred years, lived inside a doctrine because nobody had taught him to examine it. Mark, at 17, with no doctrine to inherit, has begun examining everything. The son will not be the father. The son is, philosophically, already the father superior. Not because he is stronger, not because he is kinder, because he is paying attention. And here is the small devastating thing the show does with this, which is worth holding up to the light before we move on. Nolan, in his own quiet way, is paying attention now too. He noticed at the train station. He noticed at the black hole. He noticed on Thraxa. He has been, since the moment Mark spoke that one sentence in the wreckage of a Chicago train platform, exactly the kind of person his son became. He is doing it late. He is doing it after a great deal of damage that cannot be undone. He is doing it on the worst possible learning curve, but he is doing it. The son, in noticing first, has shown the father how, and the father, after a century of refusing the practice, has finally picked it up. The philosophy of Omni-Man in this generational shape is not the philosophy of one man. It is the philosophy of a father who learned from his son how to be a person. And the empire that bred them both for war has been losing them. one quiet conversation at a time since the moment the train station went silent. Which leaves only one philosophical question still on the table, and it is the largest one the show has tried to answer. And it is the question almost every analysis of this character eventually has to confront. The question is whether Nolan Grayson can be redeemed. It is a serious question, and the show, to its credit, does not treat it lightly. The harm Nolan has done by the time the question can even be asked is enormous. He has killed 7 of his closest colleagues. He has personally caused the deaths of thousands of human beings in Chicago. He has destroyed his marriage. He has nearly destroyed his son. And these are only the crimes the show has shown in detail. Before he arrived on Earth, he was a senior Viltrumite officer in active service to an empire that has, by its own account, conquered or destroyed an unknown number of inhabited planets. He has done in his career an amount of violence so large that no human measurement can hold it. The question is whether anything he might do in the rest of his existence could possibly add up to enough on the other side of the ledger to redeem him. There are at least 3 serious answers to this question in the history of moral philosophy, and the show is in conversation with all of them. The Greek tragedians, in their best plays, treated certain acts as constitutively unredeemable. Once you had committed them, you carried them. The gods might forgive you, or they might not, but you, in your own body, would continue to be the person who had done the thing. There was no act of contrition that could change this. Oedipus in Sophocles blinds himself, but his blindness does not erase what he did. Orestes in Aeschylus kills his mother, and even after Athena herself acquits him at the end of the trilogy, he is left as a man who has killed his mother. The Greek view was that the past is the past. You cannot exit it. You can only carry it. The most you can do, ethically, is carry it well. The Greek concept of catharsis, properly understood, is not the cleansing of the deed. It is the audience's acknowledgement that some deeds cannot be cleansed. By this standard, Nolan is not redeemable, and the show, in certain moods, seems to agree. There are moments in the 2nd and 3rd seasons where Nolan, alone in a Viltrumite prison cell, says aloud the only line a Greek tragic hero would have been allowed to say. He says, "I deserve death," not as a performance, not as a bid for sympathy, as an honest accounting of what he believes the cosmic ledger reads. He has run the numbers. He has weighed the harm. He has concluded that the math, by any honest reckoning, requires his execution. He says it the way a man says, the bill is due. There is no plea attached. There is no request for mercy. It is, in tone and content, a pure Greek tragic acknowledgement of fate. The hero recognizes the verdict. The hero stops resisting it. The hero, in saying the line, has done the only thing the Greek tradition required of him. He has accepted what he is. And then, in one of the most quietly important lines in the entire show, he says, immediately, and yet, I deserve death. And yet, he does not finish it. Alan the alien, who is sharing the cell with him at that moment in the show's chronology, is exasperated by the silence. And the audience laughs, but the silence is the philosophy. What Nolan is doing, in that pause, is occupying the exact gap between the Greek tragic answer and the next answer the show is going to consider. He acknowledges the verdict. He recognizes that the math is against him. And in spite of this, he stays alive. He stays alive without claiming to have earned the staying alive. He stays alive without insisting that he deserves to. He just continues, in defiance of the verdict, to be a person who can be talked to. And yet, the 2 words do all the work. The 2 words are the doorway out of Greek tragedy and into the next available answer. The next available answer is the Christian one, though the show is not religious about it. The Christian tradition, in its most generous interpretations, treats redemption as something that can be received but not earned. The model is the prodigal son. The model is the dying thief on the cross next to Jesus, who is offered paradise in the last hours of his life, having done nothing to deserve it simply by turning his face toward grace at the end. The Christian answer is that redemption is a gift, not a wage. You cannot work your way back into innocence. You can, however, accept the offer of forgiveness, if forgiveness is offered, and you can live afterward as a person who has been forgiven, regardless of whether you objectively merit the status. The Christian answer is, in its purest form, an offer. It says, you cannot fix this. Someone else has already, in some cosmic sense, agreed to. The show toys with this answer, but does not take it. Nolan, on Earth in the seasons after his return, is not offered grace. He is not in any cosmic sense forgiven. The people he wronged do not in any clean way absolve him. Debbie does not absolve him. The show stages in one of its most painful and under-discussed scenes the conversation Nolan tries to have with Debbie after his return. He asks her, gently, to give him a chance to make things right. He says he knows he does not deserve it. He says he is going to ask anyway. He says, with the slight awkwardness of a Viltrumite trying to use a vocabulary he has only recently learned, that he had not understood before how strongly she fought for rehabilitation and that he loved her for it. Debbie listens. Debbie does not absolve him. Debbie, in fact, refuses. She does not say no forever. She says no for now. She lets him stand there. She lets him take the no. And she walks away. Nolan watches her walk away. He does not protest. He does not chase her. He does not insist on his progress. He accepts in real time that the Christian offer of grace is not on the table for him, and that whatever redemption he is going to get, if he gets any, is not going to arrive as a gift from above. This leaves the third answer, which is the Aristotelian and Camusian one, and which is the answer the show, on close reading, actually endorses. The answer is this: redemption is not a state. Redemption is a practice. You are not redeemed by some external verdict. You are not redeemed by being forgiven. You are redeemed, if you are redeemed at all, by the slow, ongoing work of becoming, one act at a time, the kind of person who would not have done what you did. The work has no guarantee. The work may not be enough. The work may end on your last day with the math still very much against you. But the work is the only thing on offer, and the alternative to the work is the slow accumulation of further harm. And so the only ethical move available to a person who has done what Nolan has done is to begin the work and not stop. Aristotle would call this the habituation of virtue. You become good, he said, by practicing good actions the way a builder becomes a builder by building. You do not need to wait for someone to certify you as a builder. You build. The building is the becoming. There is no ceremony. There is no moment of arrival. There is only the next house, and the next, and the slow accumulation of houses that, in retrospect, will reveal that the person doing the building has become, by doing it, a builder. Camus would call it the only honest answer to the absurd. You do not earn your existence. You cannot pay back what the universe gave you, because the universe was not asking for payment. What you can do is choose, in the time between your birth and your death, to live the kind of life that, if asked, you would be willing to defend. Not in a court, to yourself, at 3 in the morning, with no one watching. The Camusian project is not redemption in the religious sense. It is something stranger and more achievable. It is the construction of a life that does not require external sanction to feel worth having lived. Sisyphus, smiling at the boulder, has nothing to prove to the gods. The gods have already cursed him. The boulder is already what the boulder is. What he has is the smile. The smile is his own. And the smile, by virtue of being his own, is the only thing in the entire mythology that the gods in their omnipotence have no power to take away. Nolan in the show is in the process of building a Camusian life. He has not, by any honest accounting, earned it. He is not, by any honest accounting, going to earn it. The cosmic ledger, if there is one, will still be reading red on his last day. He does the work anyway. He fights when he is allowed to fight on the side of the people he previously tried to conquer. He helps when he is allowed to help the wife he previously betrayed and the children he previously endangered. He says, in the only piece of testimony the show has given us about his inner life, in the privacy of a prison cell shared only with an alien who barely registers as a witness, that he thinks he misses his wife. The line, in context, is a small, embarrassed thing. A man who has done what he has done is not supposed to say that he misses anyone. He is supposed to have transcended the part of himself that misses people. He is supposed to be above all of that. He is not above it. He is finally in it. He is admitting, out loud, to the only available person that the part of him that was capable of attachment is alive again, and is in pain, and is the part that has decided what he is now. This is what redemption looks like when it is being lived, rather than claimed. It is unglamorous. It is unfinished. It is, frankly, a little embarrassing. It involves saying out loud to people who have very little reason to care the small, honest things that a more dignified man would have kept private. It involves accepting that you do not get to be forgiven, and choosing to keep showing up anyway. It involves understanding, all the way down, that the philosophy that allowed you to do the worst thing you ever did is a philosophy you are now responsible for refusing in every small interaction for the rest of whatever life you are given. The Empire is not going to refuse it for you. Your family is not going to refuse it for you. Your son is not going to refuse it for you. You are going to have to refuse it, in real time, by yourself, every day in the silent ways that no one will ever record, until the day you stop. And on the day you stop, the refusing will stop being the kind of thing you do, and the doctrine in the silence you left behind will quietly begin to repopulate itself in the spaces you used to keep clear. This is the philosophy of Omni-Man, as the show has it. Not a verdict, a vigil. The man you watched almost destroy his family in the first season is, in the seasons that follow, the man holding a watch he is not allowed to put down. He is staying awake, alone, against the doctrine that lived in his blood for centuries. He is not winning. He is, on most days, not even gaining ground. He is holding. He is, in the smallest possible way, choosing. And the show is asking you, very quietly in the long hours when nobody is watching, whether the holding is enough. The question is not a rhetorical one. The show, in its later seasons, gives you a great deal of evidence on both sides and refuses to settle it for you. Some of his victims would say it is not enough. Some of his victims would be right. Some of the people he has spent the recent seasons defending, including his son, including his second son, including the wife he is still slowly trying to find a vocabulary for, would say that the holding is the only enough that was ever on offer to begin with. The show, in its discipline, declines to issue a final verdict. The verdict is yours to issue. Not because the show is being coy, because the show understands something most stories about morally complicated characters do not understand. The verdict, when it comes, will not be issued by the universe. The verdict will be issued by the people who have to keep living near the person who did the thing. And the verdict in real moral life is almost never clean. It is partial. It is provisional. It is subject to revision every time the person being judged does something new. The philosophy of Omni-Man, in the end, is the philosophy of someone who has to keep earning, in every small act, the version of forgiveness that has not yet been granted, and may never be granted, and who chooses to keep earning it anyway, because the only available alternative is to give up, and giving up is the doctrine he has finally trained himself to refuse. If everything in the last 2 hours has been about anything, in the end, it has been about this. The show called Invincible spent its first season convincing you that it was a story about a teenager getting his powers. It spent the rest of its run very gently revealing that it was always a story about an empire that did not know it had already lost. The empire lost when one of its operatives kissed his wife in a kitchen in Illinois on a Tuesday morning sometime in the early 2000s and felt, in the kiss, something the empire's vocabulary could not name. The empire lost when that operative spent 20 years failing to notice that the kiss was changing him. The empire lost when his son, lying in the wreckage of a train station, answered the empire's deepest argument with the simplest possible reply. And the empire lost most permanently when that operative chose, alone at the edge of a black hole, with no audience and no witness and no doctrine to applaud him, to break his own descent and save a ship full of insects whose deaths would not have cost him a single thing. The philosophy of Omni-Man, in the end, is the philosophy of a man who learned, the long way around, that strength is meaningless without someone to be strong for. The Empire never figured that out. It was too busy congratulating itself for not needing anyone. It will figure it out eventually, the same way every doctrine of armored loneliness has always figured it out. By being defeated, person by person, by the small, undisciplined, slightly embarrassing practice of caring about specific creatures whose names you happen to know. Go back to the black hole one last time before you sleep. He is drifting. He is about to disappear. He has not yet seen the ship. The doctrine is silent inside him, because the doctrine has nothing to say at the edge of a singularity. He is at the precise center of his own life. Everything he has ever been has come to a point that fits inside one moment, and the moment is asking him a question he has spent 500 years arranging not to hear. He has, in another few seconds, a choice. He can fall, or he can turn. He turns. He does not know why. He does not have a doctrine for it. He turns anyway because somewhere underneath the centuries of training, a small kitchen on a Tuesday morning was still being kissed, and the kiss had been quietly outvoting the Empire for longer than the Empire had been able to notice. The kiss won. That is the entire story. The kiss won. If anything here has been worth carrying with you into sleep, subscribing genuinely helps the channel keep going. Thank you for staying awake long enough to hear all of it. Sleep well. See you in the next one.